Hello? Are you out there, grade school? Are you out there, YouTube fam? Good morning to you guys. Happy damn Friday. Sorry to keep you all waiting. Sorry to hold you in suspense. My buddy Rafa, who's here with me to help me get everyone's questions answered, tells me that there was some conjecture in the chat that I'm probably running late because I'm changing a diaper. Very good bet. In fact, not the case today, but that would have been my bet as well. I'm certainly getting very good at changing diapers very quickly. I was actually just hooking up a hard drive that had misbehaved on me. So I'm got that sorted and glad to be with you guys this morning. We got a really fun topic to talk about today, a lot to cover. I want to make a couple of announcements before we get into that stuff, okay? So here's the first thing we need to talk about, guys. Every single one of us who are here today are in a pretty privileged position to be able to hang out in what I hope is safety and comfort and talk about our passion and our craft of color grading and not have to worry about having our basic needs met or providing for our families. That's not the case for a lot of people all over the world, and specifically, as you guys know, there is a full-blown crisis going on in Ukraine right now with this absolutely atrocious act of aggression that is being undertaken against the Ukrainian people right now, and it's awful. And it's especially awful for me. As you guys know, I'm a new dad, hence the dad joke about changing diapers. It's really, really awful for me to think about, you know, like right now, when my daughter gets a funny face, I worry. I'm like, oh my God, is she okay? Do I need to do something? What can I do? How can I be a good dad to her? How can I protect and provide for her? I absolutely cannot imagine right now being faced with the specter of not being able to provide for my daughter's basic needs, for my wife's basic needs, to give them shelter, to give them food, to ensure that they're safe, much less to have to be separated from them. All of these are things that are being dealt with by Ukrainian citizens right now today, and it's an awful state of affairs, and we need to do something. We need to step up and support these people however we can, because this is a very small planet that we inhabit, and these are our fellow human beings that we really need to support. I wanted to share a comment that I got yesterday that really, really sort of motivated me to think about this and you know, like made it more personal for me. So this comment says, "Hi Colin, I'm from Poland. I'm your big fan, read your book, love using your LUTs package. I watch every Friday episode, but tomorrow probably I will be driving again to the border instead to pick up more refugees from Ukraine." And they ask if I can basically bring some attention to the actions that are going on over there and to the atrocities being committed, and my answer is absolutely. So first of all, you have our admiration and respect for your courage and for what you're doing, and please stay safe out there, and we send you all the best wishes. So here's what we're going to do, guys. Here's what we're going to do on the channel. First of all, for the next 36 hours, every single thing on my website, colinkellycolor.com, all the stuff that we talk about here in grade school and that we are going to talk about today, my ebook, my core elements LUTs, and you know, those are really the main things, but also some things that are not publicly available that some of you guys have been asking me privately about, such as private coaching. All of those things for the next 36 hours, 100% of those proceeds are going to go to the UNHCR. That's the UN refugee organization that ensures that refugees are supplied with their basic needs so that they can have shelter and warmth and nutrition. So 100% of the proceeds from all sales on my website, colinkellycolor.com, are going to go to that cause for the next 36 hours. You guys know, any of you guys who watch my content, hang out here in grade school, watch the pre-recorded content on YouTube, I don't ask you guys for anything. I sell my products because I think they give good value to you guys, but I don't push those things at all. I'm pushing those right now. Go and buy those things. If you can spare $17 for the ebook that we're going to talk about today, or the core elements LUTs, they are high value assets that I think you're going to really enjoy using, and it's important more than ever right now that you go and buy them, because they are the proceeds from that purchase are going to go to a very, very necessary cause. So as I said, I don't normally ask you guys for anything. I'm asking you today, if you can spare it, if you can go 17 bucks less on your groceries, or skip a meal out, or skip a couple cups of coffee, go and purchase these things. Ideally purchase the book and the core elements LUTs pack, and let's show what we can do for our fellow humans in the Ukraine, as well as our fellow colorists as well. The other thing I want to talk about is if you don't want to purchase those assets and you don't want to contribute in that way, a couple other great ways that you can do that. The first one is that my friend Dado Valentic, who runs Color Intelligence, he's the creator of Color Lab, has set up a GoFundMe that we're going to leave a link to in the description for 3 of our colorist brothers and sisters in Ukraine right now who are trying to get out and trying to ensure their safety. That link is going to be in the description, so if you don't want to make a contribution by purchasing any of my products, make a contribution to that GoFundMe. And finally, you can go directly to the UNHCR website, USA for UNHCR. We're going to leave a link to that as well, and you can donate directly if you like. But again, I'm going to emphasize to you guys, we are privileged today to be here and talking about color and what we love most. But if you can spare it, if you can find a way to find $5, $10, $17, prioritize that, and let's show what we can do for our fellow human beings and our fellow colorists. Okay. Cool. So that's what we've got going on there. A couple other orders of business on a slightly lighter note. My show LUT course with Color Intelligence with my friend Dado Valentic is coming up in just a couple of weeks. So for any of you guys who've been asking about show LUT creation or designing LUTs or creating camera LUTs or viewing LUTs, we're going to be covering those topics in detail over that 2-week course. Highly recommend checking that out and going in and grabbing that because it's coming up fast and you don't want to miss it. It's always a really, really great community that comes together. And what I've seen from the several prior rounds of that course that we've done is you end up forming a community of really smart, really like-minded artists and colorists and post-professionals that last beyond the duration of that course. So highly recommend checking that out. We are, I've already mentioned kind of my other products, so I'm not going to re-emphasize those too much. My Elements LUT Pack is out there and available. And of course, today we are going to be talking about my ebook, The Colorist 10 Commandments, specifically commandment number 6, which is to choose, which is to choose the right tool. So we're going to be focusing on that today, and I'm going to be answering your questions about that subject and demonstrating kind of hands-on what it means to choose the right tool. Finally, I've got a couple freebies floating out there that hopefully many of you guys have had the chance to take advantage of. There's my Kodak print film emulation LUT that works really well inside of DaVinci Wide Gamut or ACES. There's my exposure chart. There's my web viewing LUT, and there's my middle grade cheat sheet. You can get all those assets individually if you want, or you can grab them all in one bundled up starter pack. Again, links for all this stuff is in the description for today's video. So that's my spiel for today. That's my announcements. And now let's get into today's topic. Let's talk about choosing the right tool inside of DaVinci Resolve. Oh no, my hard drive has gone offline. Hang tight one moment for me, guys, while I figure out why that's the case. Why my machine is misbehaving. Give me one sec here. Let's try unplugging and replugging a drive. Anybody ever have to do this before? Anybody ever have an uncooperative machine? Oh, I know one thing while I'm waiting on this to happen. I am trying out a lower latency mode here on YouTube today. So let me know out there, how's the quality look? Is the quality still acceptable on my face and more importantly on the screen share that I'm doing when I get into that in a moment? And we can also talk about latency because I want to start getting a little bit more interaction with you guys. I really like when we're able to do that. So let me know how that quality is looking, because that's obviously always the trade-off with latency. Is the lower the latency, the lower the quality tends to be. So we want to kind of find our sweet spot there. And let's see if this drive will mount back up. Okay, I think we're in business. Maybe? Okay, we're in business. Cool. Okay, let me show you my screen. And let's talk about choosing the right tool. Okay, so chapter 6 of my book, The Colorist 10 Commandments, I talk about choosing the right tool. And the fundamental idea that's resting at the sort of base of this concept is can be kind of expressed in a quote that you may have heard me use before here on the channel, which is that there's this sort of false concept in color grading that, oh, there are many ways to accomplish any goal. That's true to an extent, but I think often a better metaphor, a better way to think about that is that there are actually only 2 ways to accomplish a goal, and one of them is wrong. Okay, and when I say wrong, I don't mean wrong like you're going to get punished or a rap on the knuckles for it. When I say wrong, I mean maybe even a better way to put that is that there is the ideal way to accomplish anything. There is an ideal tool to use, and then there's everything else, right? So we want to choose the right tool. We want to choose the ideal tool. That's the tool that best supports our creative agenda and that operates with maximum efficiency, and which of course does no damage to our image, does no harm to our image, which is in fact the first commandment in the book, first do no harm, okay? So it really pays to figure out what the right tool is, to choose the right tool. So the question that always comes up right after that is like, okay, great, that makes good enough sense that the tool we choose matters and that we should choose a better one over a worse one. But how do we make that choice? How do we decide what the right tool is? Here's the way that I like to think about it. This is not a particularly simple, or simple is the wrong word. This is not a particularly like quick tip, quick cheat for choosing the right tool. But the reality is this: if you want to choose the right tool, you need a couple things. First of all, you need to know what all your options are. So you need to know what all the tools are. And then you need to understand with a fairly high level of detail what each one of them does, right? There's really no way around that. If you're trying to work your way around it, you may end up with the right tool, but you're not really choosing the right tool. If I tell you that you should use your gain instead of your highlight knob, for example, you might take that advice and you might get better results by taking that advice. But I would argue to you, you're not really choosing the right tool in that scenario. You're just being told which tool to use, and that's very different than the essence of this commandment to me, which is to make a full and thorough survey of all the tools we might use, and then gain a dimensional and detailed understanding of how each works, and with that knowledge, decide what works best for your creative agenda, okay? Now, there's lots of different ways that this can play out, but before I move on to taking any questions from you guys on this topic, and those of you who may have read the book. And by the way, let me know in the chat if you have read the book. If you certainly have questions about it, I'd love to hear those. But let me know in the chat if you've read the book. Do you like it? Do you hate it? Do I know what I'm talking about? Am I nuts? Love to hear about that. I want to give a quick demonstration of one example of choosing the right tool. And we're just going to make a really simple one. We're going to talk about actually something that I alluded to a moment ago. I want to shape my highlights, okay? I want to figure out what's the ideal tool for shaping my highlights. Let's find a good image to kind of evaluate this on so that it's a bit less of an abstract exercise. Let's see here. Well, let's see. I want to find an image with some good, strong highlights happening within it. Let's see here. Yeah, we can go over here to this one for now. Of course, that's the one that is disconnected. All right, let's hang out with, oh, here we go. Perfect. All right, so first things first, let's get some basic color management going. So I have my airy image here, and I'm going to do a node-based DaVinci wide gamut workflow, which is going to be in line with what we've been talking about in our DaVinci wide gamut workflow series, which we're going to get back to next week. So I'm just going to do a quick color management pipeline using nodes. I could do this exact same thing using my project settings, but I'm going to do it using nodes just because that's my preference. Okay. So we're going to go Arri Alexa log C to DaVinci wide gamut intermediate. We'll call this in, and then on the output side, we're going to say DaVinci wide gamut, DaVinci intermediate, direct 7 and 9 gamut 2.4 with the following settings. Okay, great. So we've got some color management set up, all right? So let's say that I want to tame in some of these practicals that I'm seeing back here in the frame. Oh, and just because it's bugging me, let's just do a quick balance on this, okay? So I'm going to do this using a similar or the exact approach that I'm talking about in the DaVinci wide gamut workflow series right now. So I've got my exposure, I've got my ratio. I'm going to say I'm fine with those things for now. Then I've got my balance, and I'm just going to use my offset to find a balance, something like that. Okay, so now I've got a balanced image, and I want to talk now about this task that I've laid out to myself. Let's say for the moment, color management's good, the look is good. I don't even have a look, but let's just say I love whatever my look is. I've got my exposure, I've got my ratio, and I've got a balance. And now my sort of more tweaky, like fine-tuned note is that I want to bring in those highlights on the practicals behind my subject a little bit. How am I going to do that? What do I do? Let's think about this. So there's a bunch of different ways to do this, aren't there? And you guys, if you'd like, can sound in on the chat. What are some of the tools that I might use to make this adjustment? I'm going to tweak this balancing node here. Good. So a couple just off the top of the dome here. Gain, right? I could bring in, oops, that looks super normal. I could bring in my highlights with my gain. That's a quite broad, quite global operation. I've got my highlights here. That's a little more narrow. Okay. I could go over to my log wheels and I could work on my highlight range there. That's quite narrow, isn't it? It's barely affecting even the practicals, and it's certainly not bleeding down into anything else. I could go over to my HDR zones palette and I could either define a custom region or use the light or the highlight region and get a sense for what that's doing, right? I could go to my custom curves. I could adjust the top end of my image there. So that's not even a comprehensive list. That's just a couple of kind of usual suspects of things that I might do. So this is all leading to the answer to the question. How do we choose the right tool? In this case, I want to recommend a sort of two-step workflow to you. First of all, come up with a sort of list of candidates for your particular operation. And let's say in my case, my potential candidates, the gain, I feel like that's just too broad. I'm not really into what that's doing. So I want to focus on what is happening here in my highlights versus what's happening in my log wheels. Actually, I'll tell you what, let's do the gain. So we're going to look at gain versus highlights versus our log highlights. Okay. Confusingly, highlights and highlights, those two controls control different things. I kind of wish they had a different name, but they don't. So we're going to focus on those three things. Okay. So here's the challenge, guys. If all we do is look at what this does to an image, we might start to get a sense for like what works for us on that image. But if we want to choose the right tool, we need to get a more sort of like macro level understanding of what this tool is doing in its net, not just what it does on one image. Okay. So one way that we can do that when we're talking about anything tonal, meaning anything that involves contrast or luminance or exposure, as opposed to something that involves color, like an RGB balance, is we can evaluate what we are doing on a grayscale ramp. Okay. So let me just show you guys how to make a grayscale ramp if you don't already know how to do this. I'm going to go over to my edit page and I'm going to go to my generators here and I'm going to go to my grayscale. And I'm just going to drop this into my timeline. Let me move it over, move some of this junk out of the way and drop it in right here and just kind of trim it into a reasonable length. And now I need to do one more thing because right now if I go back over to my color page, this grayscale clip won't show up. So I'm just going to create a new compound clip, right click and hit new compound clip like I just did. I've called it ramp and now I'm going to see it populated here in my color page. Now, as you can see, my ramp is actually not a pure linear ramp right now because I'm seeing the results of my output transform. So for the moment, I want to turn this off. This is one of the reasons why I like working in nodes. This to me is a little bit faster than hitting bypass color management or going into my project settings and turning off my output transform. This is the state that I want to evaluate my operation on because I'm looking at what we could think of as a unity state right now, meaning nothing at all applied to the image, pure linear ramp from top to bottom, which makes it really, really easy to compare and contrast the operation of different tools, okay? So let's start with our gain. I've done this exercise before with gain, so you guys may already be familiar with what you're gonna see next, but gain is the broadest of the tools that we are going to evaluate. It has the most influence on the top end of the image, but it actually affects pretty much every pixel in the image except for a pixel with a value of 0, okay? So it's a very broad operation. That may or may not be what we want, but it's helpful for me to get that profile in my mind. So in addition to knowing what it does visually, I have a sense for what it's doing under the hood. It is broadly and linearly affecting the high end of the image with a very gradual fall off that extends all the way down to the bottom of the image. Does that make sense? Let's compare that now and go over to our log highlights, okay? If I go over here and I move this down, you can see that region, that fall off is a bit more severe, right? It's only going to around 512 here and everything below here is remaining unaffected, right? So it's somewhat of a narrower tool. Again, that's something we can observe visually and we should observe visually, but we also want to start to get a sense for what it's doing in terms of the actual like tone scale of the image, okay? And it's worth noting here with our highlights, we can actually control what we define as our range for our highlights. So as I said, my range right now is roughly the upper 50% of my tone scale, right? You can see that right here around 512 out of 1023, I am having virtually no more influence on the image, right? So if I modify my range, you can see that I can cause more and more of this image to be swept up in this highlights operation. So that's good to understand what that range knob is doing. And it's also a great example of something that we might discover in a different way than if we were just playing around with it on an image itself, because now we can see like, oh, wow, I've actually got more than one type of tool in my highlights wheel, because not only do I have, okay, I've got the response of what I adjust here, but I've also got a custom range that I can define there. So that could be pretty useful, right? And the last thing that I want to look at would be my highlights themselves. So let's take a look at these. Okay, so that's similar to the highlights wheel with a sort of like moderate to low set range, like we're having a pretty broad influence on the image. Okay, that's cool. Reason I wanted to demo the highlights in addition to these other two tools though, is if we go back over to this image, I want to point out to you guys that ultimately that tone scale is not the full story, it's only a part of it. We need to, if we're going to really start to develop a profile of these pieces, I want to point out to you guys something that maybe I can best visualize here on this chart. If I turn these highlights down, can we see on this guy? Maybe not. Maybe even on this image here. Give me 1 second, make sure I've got this properly input mapped. This is some ACES linear stuff. Okay, I'm just curious, if I zoom in on these sparks and I pull these highlights in, it's tough to spot here as well. What I'm trying to drive at, what I want to show you is that the highlights, in addition to altering the tonality of our image, they're actually altering the texture of our image. I think the sort of genesis of this tool is the common urge or impulse on the part of the colorist to quote unquote recover highlights. And we talked a little bit about recovering highlights last week and why I think that's a problematic turn of phrase. But when we have truly clipped out highlights that are gone, that were not recorded, no information was recorded in that area in the original negative, what's happening here is we are actually altering the texture of the image to try to give the appearance of some kind of tonal variance or texture in the image. That can be good or that can be bad, but we sure want to know about it, right? That you can see how that would really affect our choice of tool. When we look at our highlights wheel, if we understand, even if on a particular image, like right now, I'm having trouble finding an image where this proves out. Maybe if I looked at this fire back here, it would be easier to spot. Yeah, this is a pretty good example here. I'm not actually recovering detail here as much as I am pumping texture into that region of the image. So that's an example of what I would consider to be a kind of favorable result if I wanted to get some more texture out of that. However, it is a fundamentally different operation than applying our gain or our log highlights or really any other tonal control that we can. So really long-winded explanation, but what I want to emphasize to you guys in terms of this idea of choosing the right tool is there's no shortcut. Some of the best homework that you can do as a colorist is to just spend time playing around with stuff and A/B testing things inside of Resolve so that at any point you can very quickly, when you get a note in the room with your client and they're like, hey, I want to bring those highlights in and make sure that any texture we can get is in there, or I want to cool off that portion of the frame, or whatever the note may be, you can instantaneously in your mind not only come up with a list of 5, 6, 7, 8 potential ways to tackle that problem, but you can also make a good first gut guess as to which is going to be best. Then you're in a position where you're likely going to get good results out of the box. And if you don't, you can very quickly pivot. If the client's not digging it, if you're not digging it, you can say, okay, no problem. I got another idea. I'm going to throw this one at it and just go to the next idea sort of in your priority list. You can see how that would be an incredibly valuable skill to have as a colorist. So that's the whole theme here. Choose the right tool. And that really comes down to being able to very quickly index what are going to be the really viable candidates for what I'm trying to do, and what's going to be the most viable one, and let me give it a try. If that doesn't work, let me pivot over to the next one, and so on and so forth. And that really begins with having a 360 knowledge of all of your tools in Resolve. That'll take time to build up, but it is time well spent. So, longer demonstration than maybe I meant to make about choosing the right tool, but I hope that stimulated some questions out there. Let's hear what we got there, Rafa.
I have a question from Easy Zonka, and he wants to know curves and wheels. Do they do exactly the same, or how to differentiate them and know when to use each tool?
Yeah, great question. So it's, you know, we're talking about like a comparison that we didn't make just now that we very easily could have made of like, okay, what's the difference between our curves and our primaries wheels, right? Let's get an input mapping for this image here. Like so. Oh, hang on. There we go. All right, I'm going to reset my balance here, and let's talk about curves versus our primaries. So, same kind of thing that we could do. I'm going to cheat a little bit and do a faster version of what I was just showing you guys with that ramp. I've just got a little DCTL saved that I use for generating grayscale ramps right on whatever image I'm operating on. So if I look at this grayscale ramp here, let's compare gain versus making an adjustment in our curves, okay? So just as a starting point, I'm going to turn that, let me actually move this over here. There we go. So let's just look at this empty node here and once again evaluate, okay, what does gain do? Okay, gain is just linearly moving stuff up and down. Great. So we could go to our curves, and as a starting point, I could one-to-one recreate gain if I wanted to. You want to know how? Move the line in the same way that I was just moving it in my primaries. Grab that top point, move it left or right, or move it either to the left or downward. Does that make sense? This is one-to-one a gain operation. Exact same thing. Exact same thing. No difference whatsoever. Now, if I wanted to get fancier with it, this is kind of where the curves become a helpful tool to evaluate. This is, we can sort of connect this idea up to another chapter of the book where we talk about simplicity beating complexity. So for example, if I can get done what I want to get done with gain, that tells me that, or the rule of thumb tells me that I should do it with gain rather than with a more complex tool, such as my highlights knob or my log gain, or my log highlights, that is. But I could start, for example, with my curves. One reason I might like to use them is that I can begin by doing a gain adjustment here in my curves. And then I might say, okay, that's great, but I actually want to leave things a bit more linear up until around this point in the image. And now we can sort of contour things ourselves. And you guys can notice, by the way, that I've got a one-to-one match here in my waveform to what I'm seeing here in my curves, which is helpful to observe as well. So that's the idea. At the fundamental level, curves are the same as our primaries. They are manipulating our tone scale everywhere in between 0 and 1. It's just that with our primaries, we have fixed mathematical operations that if we want to do something that we can't express with those operations, such as, you know, like, that's probably not anything I really want to see on an image, but if I did, I could not do it on my primaries because there is no knob that I can make this shape with, if that makes sense. So our curves are sort of like our next layer of complexity for like, all right, I have a creative urge or a technical need to make a shape that I can't make with the shapes that I'm able to produce with my primaries. But fundamentally, custom curves and primaries are making the same manipulation. It's just a question of how and how much control we have as the end user.
Okay. What is the best way to add warmth to an image or coldness while keeping clean whites and blacks?
Well, that's an interesting question. Here's one good thing to observe about color management. This is something that I didn't really understand when I first began working color managed. One of the things that is nice about color management is it gives us more of a photometric grading environment. So let's ask that question in the context of the real world. All right. So what's a good example? If I'm standing outside in my backyard, it's 6 in the morning. The light has a particular quality, right? It's kind of soft, it's kind of subdued, it's cooler in color. And I'm standing outside at 3 in the afternoon. in that same environment. The light's harder, the light's warmer, right? What am I going to perceive a white sheet of paper? What color am I going to perceive that white sheet of paper as in both of those settings? Am I going to perceive it as, oh, that white sheet of paper is blue here and red there? No, because our eye kind of is like calibrating to those cues about like what time of day we're in and the color temperature and all that stuff. Similar kind of thing with our color management. When you're working color managed and you are doing the simplest possible operation we can do, we've been talking about this in the DaVinci Wide Gamut Workflow series. What's the simplest possible way that we could be operating on our, balance of our image? That would be our offset, right? Just because that's straight up addition and subtraction. So if I wanted to do that, I could adjust this here, and we know from having made prior evaluations on a grayscale ramp here, that offset is literally affecting the entire image, right? I'm just moving everything in one piece, up or down. So you could look at this and perhaps intuit like, well, oh, if I move things way up to here, I'm gonna have these like poisoned highlights that are gonna be white. It's not exactly how it works when you're inside of a color managed environment any more than changing the color temperature of your light out in the real world is going to alter the perception of your highlights. So I would say the easiest, simplest way to preserve your shadows and highlights while warming or cooling the image would be to do what we've been doing in the DaVinci Wide Gamut Workflow series, where we simply adjust our offset. I'm not saying it will have no influence, but it's generally going to have a desirable influence in terms of moving the image in one piece and making it feel natural and organic. So that would be one potential candidate. Other things that you could look at if you wanted to, if you were more intent on preserving your shadows and highlights. Let's make another quick experiment since we've been having fun with the ramp today. Anybody can describe or just visualize what am I going to see when I make a gamma adjustment right now on this ramp? Let me actually go to the chat. Let me see how our lag is doing. Someone give me a quick description if you can key it in. What's going to happen when I move my gamma wheel to the right in just a second here? What am I going to see visually on this waveform down here in the lower right? We'll see how the lag is today. It might still be too slow. I went for the kind of like intermediate latency mode. I'll give it just another second here just because I'm curious. There we go, Photo Gabby, a hump. Good description. We're basically going to see a hump. So if I go over here to node number 6, move my gamma to the right, it's exactly right. It's kind of a rainbow, right? So gamma, in terms of its effect on the image, is going to affect the entire image very similar to the way offset does, with two very important exceptions. What are the two things that are not moving in this compared to offset? Boink and boink. Shadows, highlights. Very bottom black, very peak white. So another thing that you could consider that we talked about in a fairly recent episode of Grade School about how I've sometimes given gamma a hard time, but what we're talking about is actually exactly what gamma has traditionally been used for, which is to manipulate balance in between shadows and highlights. So that would be another option there. But I would consider those two things. You could get more granular if you want to, but I would actually, perhaps most importantly, change the way I'm thinking about that question in just a little bit, in just a bit, I should say, because what are we actually attempting to do when we say we want to change the color temperature of an image without affecting our shadows or our highlights? I assume that that's because we want to get an organic or a naturalistic reproduction as opposed to a strange looking one. Let me just, very fast example here. Like, here would be another way that we could absolutely do this. Let's qualify it. Let's do my favorite move, the qualifier. And let's say, okay, all this stuff is going to be left out of the party. And then all of my highlights are going to be left out like so. And so I'm just going to be kind of grading this stuff in the middle. Okay, let's move this high up just a little bit so the skin is in there. So something like that is probably a more literal visualization of what we're looking to affect. And now within that, let's do an offset operation. And let's actually choke that in even further so that we're having even less influence on that high end. I don't love the way that looks. I don't think the image is stronger for tearing it apart and saying, oh, we're going to push this that way and leave that behind. I don't particularly think that produces naturalistic results. That's something you should explore for sure. Draw your own conclusions, see what you think. But that would be a more focused and narrow way of accomplishing that agenda. Like, all right, let's do exactly that. Let's leave off our luminance or leave off the low and the top end of the image and only affect the middle of it. You could do it with something like this, and then it's up to you to evaluate how well or poorly you like that adjustment. What else?
Okay, in what situations do you consider camera raw settings? For example, exposure, highlight, temperature.
Gosh, I feel like maybe it's just a similar. Did we get that one here live today, Rafa?
Can you repeat?
Did that question come in live today?
Yep.
Okay, gotcha. So maybe just similar to one that we recently answered. I'll put it to you this way. I always want to carry over the metadata from production, generally speaking anyway, the ISO and the actual color temperature that were used during the shoot. So like if I look for, do I have a piece of raw material I can reference here? Perhaps not. Well, regardless, let me go to my camera raw settings. What I'm generally going to do with like red, for example, is I'm going to say, use the ISO and the color temperature that the camera person set up in camera. Those are important variables that are going to have a big influence on the way I grade the image. That's what I use from in terms of production metadata. Everything else I'm going to zero out and do myself. So that's sort of the first part of the question. And then if we're asking about like which controls in the camera raw am I going to be manipulating here as opposed to up here? Like I said, I talked about this, I think, last week in grade school. For me, the answer is none. Because unless I'm grading a show that was all shot on that same camera, I don't want to have to manipulate things one way for one camera and another way for a different camera. And just to round that out, I don't see any advantage to doing things here at the site of debayer versus in my debayered camera space or in my debayered working space, because I'm only going to debayer into a big, broad working space where nothing's going to be clipped, nothing's going to be clamped. All of that original pixel data is still at my fingertips, and I'm just going to be manipulating it with familiar tools and tools that I can use on any and all shots, regardless of whether they all happen to be that same raw format. So for me, carry over the metadata from production in terms of color temperature, ISO, possibly tint. Everything else I'm going to wipe out and tee up in the way that I want to for my pipeline. And I generally am not going to do any actual color correction or adjustment here in the camera raw tab for those reasons.
Okay, people is saying that I'm accusing holy reverb in my audio that makes it almost impossible to understand me. That's first of all.
Okay, maybe let me just try turning you down. I wonder if that like makes it worse somehow. Because it should be like your levels are fine over on my side. Yeah, sorry guys. Let's see if that helps things.
Let's try now, maybe.
Yeah, I've got you nice and quiet.
All right, let's wait for the chat so that people can listen to the next question. Maybe using this new low latency mode. Excellent now. Okay, thank you guys.
Nice.
So, do you ever use the color checker color match panel in your work? What operations are going on under the hood to achieve those image transformations?
Oh, that's a good question. It's I don't want to demo it out in full length today. Help me remember Cullen Kelly Color team to find the grade school episode where we explore this in detail. But I definitely will use it. Like actually the image that we're on right now is a great example. What it's doing under the hood is comparing the values that are being read in here with the known stored internal values for the way that these patches on this color checker should meter in terms of like the spec they were manufactured to. It's drawing a comparison, and then it is creating essentially a 3D LUT is not exactly the right way to describe it, but that's the idea, is it's creating a 3D transformation that best fits what was actually captured and remaps it into what those colors should be based on those known stored internal values. I use it all the time. Generally speaking, if you give me a color checker chart, I'm going to at least run a match on it and see how I like the results. Maybe I won't like them, maybe I'll hate them. Something that I will often get is like, if you shoot a color checker but you don't match the lighting conditions of the actual scene, then that's not really useful to me. So if you like, exaggerated example, but one that I've seen many times, if you're shooting in a darker type of scene and you hold the color checker right up in front of the lens and then you shine a flashlight on it so that the lens can see it, that doesn't do me any good because that's not the same illuminant that's hitting the scene. But generally speaking, if you provide a color checker for me, I'm going to at least try it out and see how it looks. And we will find that episode for you guys where I show you the full workflow of doing that matching exercise. And I essentially will use that as the, if I end up saying, yes, that's good, that's better than it was, I'll use that as the foundation for my sort of like technical or corrective balance of the image, and then do my creative RGB balancing downstream of that.
Okay, here's a good one. What is the difference between ACES transform with the Resolve Color Space Transform plugin and the ACES Transform plugin? And if I can use ACES Transform with the CST plugin, then can I use Resolve Film Looks LUTs in my ACES workflow?
Oh boy, that is a good one. Lots of juicy questions in there. So the first question is, okay, what is the difference between the color space transform and the ACES transform? And specifically the difference between, if I do a color space transform here, the question is, we're correctly identifying, hey, there's like ACES stuff in here. Okay, so what's the difference between doing ACES stuff inside of a color space transform versus just using an ACES transform? The difference, to put it broadly, is math. Like in some cases, there's no difference, but generally speaking, it's just different math. You guys have heard me make the analogy before that sort of applies here. In a lot of cases of having to make color space transformation when we're in Resolve or in other applications, there are subjective trade-offs and compensations that need to be made. Sometimes it's a really simple, straightforward solution if you're going from big, huge color space A to exactly same size but different color space B. If you're doing that, you can do that with very simple objective tools that are really not going to vary too much. There's really only one sound way to do that, and it's just a question of how precisely you do it, but there's no, there's really only one sound way to do it. If you're going, for example, from any mismatched size of color space A to color space B, there's some more subjectivity that comes into play. So the difference between using ACES color spaces and gamma inside of the color space transform versus an ACES transform, it's just the actual math that's being used to solve that transformation under the hood. You can get good results with either. In terms of the end result, you're not going to see a big, huge difference between the two. So I would say, like, in general, if you are wanting to use ACES things, use the ACES transform, unless you're doing something slightly non-standard like we've talked about here in grade school about like, oh, I'm grading DaVinci wide gamut, but I want to output ACES linear from my VFX vendor. That would be a situation where I would output an ACES standard using a color space transform. And then the next part of the question, the film looks LUTs, can I use those in a DaVinci wide gamut workflow if I... Rafa, can you repeat that part of the question for me? I want to make sure I'm actually getting that right.
Yeah, give me a moment. And if I can use ACES Transform with the Color Space Transform plugin, then can I use Resolve Film Look LUTs in my ACES workflow?
Okay, there it is. Yeah. So can we use the Resolve Film Looks LUTs in your ACES workflow? No. Here's the deal. The whole premise of ACES, of DaVinci wide gamut, of any color management system is that we have this sacred in-between space where we can do all of our grading. And this in-between space doesn't care where you came from, and it doesn't care where you're going. It's just a train station where you can do all of your grading. So it doesn't matter what your camera is, doesn't matter what your display is, you're gonna do the same grading here inside of this safe space in between the camera and the display. The Resolve Film Looks LUTs don't play nice with that because the Resolve Film Looks LUTs, in addition to imparting a sort of creative character that we may like for our images, they also impart a display transformation. That's what this Rec 709, Kodak 20, this Rec 709, D65, those two parts of the name here inside of the film looks LUTs, those are denoting the actual output color space of this LUT. So in addition to imparting a particular creative look, we are imparting a technical transformation from film printing density, roughly speaking, film log space, and transforming into Rec 709 D65. And ACES doesn't like that because ACES says, hey, I want that job. I'm going to handle all that. You're just in between. You're going to stay in the nice, safe, sacred working space, and I will handle transforming you out to Rec 709 or HDR or PQ or whatever you might be transforming to. I, ACES, want to handle that, and I can't play nice with any LUT that tries to usurp that authority from me, if that makes sense. That got a little bit weird with me narrating myself as the ACES entity in the first person, but let's roll with it. Hope that helps.
Okay, we have a question from Jim Robinson from a couple of weeks ago. Given the method of using macro over micro as a workflow, shouldn't the first thing be to check the camera manufacturer middle gray and set the overall exposure and pivot point to respect the DP decisions as a starting level, then proceed to fine tune at the clip level?
Yeah, I'm glad we get to this one because I forget where, but I saw this one from Jim and I thought it was a really good question that is good to answer. So the idea there is 100% correctly. It's like we want our baseline to be a balanced starting position, right? We want to make sure that from sensor all the way out to display that we are keeping middle gray where it belongs. We can move it wherever the hell we want to when we start to get into shot level grading and creative decision making and subjective adjustment, but we want to have a balanced system at the foundation. Jim is 1000% right about that. The only tweak that I would make to that is to sort of fill in the gaps and say that by default, when I, for example, turn on my little DaVinci wide gamut node-based pipeline that I've built here. Let me just confirm I've got that back where it belongs. Yeah, so we are going here from Arri Alexa log C to DaVinci wide gamut intermediate. And then we are going from DaVinci wide gamut intermediate out to Rec 709. So this is one of those rare instances where the answer is actually simpler than we think, easier than we think. This is actually already preserving middle gray for us perfectly because those tone curves, what's happening here under the hood, we are decoding log C and we are decoding its mid-gray position, which is around 0.391, out to a 0.18, 18% gray in linear light. And then we are re-encoding that into DaVinci wide gamut intermediate, which has a different middle gray position that escapes me at the moment. I think maybe 343 on a 10-bit scale, something like that. And so in this transformation, we are perfectly preserving the middle gray of the system, if that makes sense. And then out here on the display side, you guys have heard me mention this before, but middle gray, in terms of the way it ought to map on a display, is a bit less of a objective like assessment that we can make. But suffice it to say, it is being appropriately, reasonably mapped out to a good place here at the site of our display transform. And actually the only tweak, if you notice here, I have moved my adaptation from its default value of 9 up to a default value of 16, expressly because I like parking middle gray just a bit higher than where it rests in display space with a default value of 9 on my adaptation. But that's kind of a tangent. The main thing I want us to take away here is that the system itself, a good color management framework set up properly, is actually going to preserve middle gray in and of itself. And the first place we really need to watch out, the first place where things really go sideways here, is when we introduce our look. Looks are very, very easy to inadvertently move middle gray on. Now, you guys have seen me demonstrate before using my exposure chart, how you can actually sample the middle gray of your container. So if I look for my exposure chart and I go to DaVinci wide gamut intermediate and I set my total steps to 1, turn off my ramp, here's middle gray in my working space, okay? So if I'm building my own look, I could just tap that mid gray, and now in my custom curves, I have a control point for mid gray. And so I can know that, all right, I can move stuff below or I can move stuff above, but I should not be actually moving my middle gray. Now that's interesting. Oh wait, let me do this actually. There we go. Now my control point is properly lined up. And you can see that even as I draw this curve, that mid gray point isn't actually changing. So if I now turn this off, This is a rather zany looking contrast curve that I've drawn, but it is preserving middle gray, okay? So that's the easiest place for mid-gray preservation to get inadvertently thrown out the window. And the easiest way to protect against it is to use my exposure chart, or if you are using a third-party LUT or plugin, to use a reputable one like my Elements LUTs, which in and of themselves all perfectly preserve middle gray right out of the box. So that would be kind of the only other addendum there, but I just want to point out that we don't actually need to worry about the camera middle gray because our color management is going to safely move that camera middle gray to where it needs to be to live in our working space, and also move it safely out to a reasonable position for our display space.
Can you go over the relationship between the highlight/shadow ranges numerical values and the histogram/waveform values and the color picker value?
Yes, I think I can do that. So if we are talking about, you know, like sort of coordinating, like, or aligning our understanding of the ranges of our, I assume we are talking about our log wheels here. So these ranges are both 0 to 1, okay? Now, this is kind of worth noting, like these log wheels are obviously designed to work inside of a log container. And it's interesting that by default, if you look at, okay, this range here, this is my low range as denoted by this downward arrow, and up here is my high range as denoted by this upper arrow. It's kind of interesting that with these tools that are designed to ostensibly affect a much narrower range than something like lift and gain, that's kind of the promise of the so-called shadow and highlight wheels here in the log controls, it's sort of interesting to observe that, like, okay, wow, so this narrow tool that's only supposed to affect my very deepest shadow, it occupies a third of the container. That's what that means here. This 0.333, this is on a scale of 0 to 1. So this means that everything below 1/3 is going to be swept up. And we can see that visually like so. Let's do our grayscale ramp, turn off our output transform, and observe that if I do my shadows down here, I'm affecting everything up to around this 300 code value level here. It just so happens that when you're in log, that is the intuition about where shadows and where highlights ought to sit when you're in a log container is a bit different from the way it actually plays out. Same thing with our highlights. That's actually even more extreme. It's like, wait, so you're telling me this like narrow highlight control affects 45% of my image? That seems like a lot. That doesn't seem all that narrow. But if you actually look at the way it plays out on an image, we can observe that it is indeed affecting a fairly small amount of the image here, because there's a lot of image that just doesn't have anything going on. I mean, you can see here, I'm like slamming this wheel. I'm getting almost no response visually at all. You can see a little happening here in the waveform, but visually it's almost tough to spot. That's because there's very little pixel value in this image that occupies 55% or higher in terms of that 0 to 1 range. And we can sort of correlate that with our ranges here in our histogram and see, oh, wow, indeed, the entire image is occupying about the bottom 50% of the overall container. And I've got all this room off to the right where if I do stuff over here, you know, like just to sort of like visualize something, visualize things a bit more. Let me get a unity point there. Like, unless I do something so extreme that it starts to bend stuff to the left of this control point, nothing's really going to happen because there's no image data up here. There's almost no image data up there. So that's a long answer to sort of like figuring out what this exactly means here in your log wheels. This means we're affecting the bottom 33% of the signal in our log space in this case, and the upper 55%. And then it just comes down to getting enough practice and wherewithal working in log spaces, working in color managed workflows of saying like, okay, that may feel like a massive portion of the image, but it's actually not that much because there are entire segments of that 0 to 1 range, which are often not going to be occupied by any pixel data at all, or by very, very little pixel data. Was there another part to that question? I think that was it.
Yeah, that was it. How would you use the false color plugin and why?
I, as a colorist, generally am not going to use the false color plugin. I'm more going to go off of what I'm seeing visually. That's not to throw any shade at a false color plugin, or certainly at the use of it on set if it helps you figure out what you're holding versus what you're clipping, which is the traditional role of it on set. I don't really care from my POV what's clipped on the bottom or the top, because there's nothing I can do about it. It's either in the neg or it's not, but I don't necessarily need a visualization of that. And in terms of visualizing whether I'm clipping something, I don't necessarily need such an aggressive and distracting visual in order to tell me that. Because first of all, I'm using good color management. So I know that generally speaking, if I pass a reasonably exposed image through this system, I don't expect there to be much clipping whatsoever. And what little there is going to be clipping that I'm okay with or that I can see visually. And if anything, like I would be more inclined to use something like the exposure chart, for example, where I can evaluate, like let's crank up our steps here. This is another way that I use this exposure chart all the time. Okay, how many steps can I see above and below mid-gray? So I can see, that's not too bad. Even in SDR, above mid-gray, if I've got my total steps at, let's say 17, I can just perceive the difference between this and that on my monitor anyway. So that means that I can perceive a full 8 stops above mid-gray. And probably by the time I go to 18, I really can't spot the difference between these two. I mean, maybe, but it's pretty tiny. And certainly by like 19 or 20, these like highest couple of patches read the same to me. They're clipping out. So I'd be more inclined to use something like this to evaluate, okay, how many stops am I preserving in my overall system? And I would kind of evaluate that at the outset of my look design and say, okay, we've drawn our curve, but having drawn that curve, like let's just do our, let me pull up one of my LUTs here again, and let's put this exposure chart downstream, like so. Sorry, so I'm going to do exposure chart and then LUT, like so. And so with that look in place, something that I'll often do with my client in the room, if they're geekier like I am, is I'll just look at, okay, this is all good and well. We're kind of visually happy maybe with what our look is doing. Let's just get a reality check and say like, all right, with this look in place, how much dynamic range am I preserving versus how much am I kind of flattening out by doing it here? Because that might be like if I were to discover, oh wow, I can't see more than 3 stops above mid-gray, that might make me decide to go in and alter my look, even if otherwise I'm pretty happy with it. But in this case, you can see, all right, so I'm able to get, you know, my, like if I try to count things up, I'm able to get a reasonable count of 6, 7, 8 stops maybe above mid-gray before things start to fuse together and I really can't see the delineation there. And same thing down in my shadows, I can see a healthy number of steps before things clip off to 0, like so. So that would be kind of like, I would probably use this exposure chart more for that challenge than with false color, because false color, like from my perspective, like I just want to make pretty pictures, you know, and like cinematographers care about like, well, I don't need to see what the image looks like right now. I just need to see what I'm holding and what I'm clipping. For me, it's more distracting than useful because I'm not in that business of preserving exposure. I'm just in the business of evaluating, and it's a distracting thing to look at this giant neon green or neon pink wash of something in the image. That's just my take. I'm sure others have different ones, but my workflow would be to use something more like the exposure chart, backed by a really sound color management framework so that I don't have to worry too much about clipping stuff out that otherwise should be preserved. Let's do one more.
Okay, when creating a very pushed look, when do you reach your threshold of switching from broad stroke tools to preserve skin tone to using some other tool like qualifiers for preserving them, the skin tones, I mean?
It's an easy answer for me that not everyone is going to share this take on. That actually is the edge for me. The moment I can't keep good skin tone with broad tools is the moment I'm done. The only caveat I would give you guys there is that, like, you know, I've got a bit of a different relationship with image manipulation because, like, for example, if we look at these CKC elements LUTs that I keep referring to here, so we've looked at the tone ones. These are just contrasts, as the name implies. They're not affecting hue really directly. They're just affecting the amount, like the contrast in the red, green, and blue channels. But if we like throw one of these on and then look at some of these palette LUTs here, like you can see I'm doing kind of what's just being described. Like, wow, I'm really swinging things in a cool direction, except for skin, which is really not moving very much. I'm doing that. Like, I don't want to be like, go all like secret handshake on you guys, but I'm not doing that with the color warper or with tools inside of Resolve. Maybe I could if I tried, but it's not something, that's not generally the way I work. I'm working in a different environment and using different tools to exact what I feel are really, really clean and organic manipulations that still are able to get fairly targeted, if that makes sense. Like I really can target blues, but leave my red tones alone, for example. That would be kind of like, that's where I will make that shift, if anywhere, is like, all right, let's get deep into the color science side of things and really sculpt things using some better tools. But generally speaking, that edge for me is like, okay, if I can't get it with broad tools, if broad tools make my skin look weird, that's when I know I'm all in, I'm done. I want to back off and, first do no harm, to go back to that chapter of my book. So that would kind of be my answer there. I'm sure you would hear different answers from other colorists, and I'd be actually interested to hear how they do address that, because it is a real thing. But for me, I keep myself out of trouble by simply making sure that, like, all right, if you're starting to poison stuff and you got to get really narrow in order to protect things, that's usually a pretty good cue to me that if I haven't reached the end of the rainbow, I'm close to it, and I need to be ready to sort of halt what I'm doing and not get overly greedy about making a really, really aggressive, bold look, if that makes sense. Okay, guys, hour well spent as always. Thank you very much for joining me. Really love hanging out with you guys on Friday for grade school. We're going to get back onto our DaVinci Wide Gamut workflow series next week. We're also going to have a very special grade school next week that I'm going to be announcing some details about very soon. But suffice it to say, you do not want to miss next week's grade school. It's going to be something that we haven't done in a while, and it's going to be really special, really, really cool. So mark your calendars. It's going to be awesome. In the meanwhile, I'm going to make one more emphasis. Go and support the refugees in Ukraine and the cause of folks who are experiencing real hardship and danger in Ukraine. Go buy my LUTs, go buy my ebook on my website. 100% of the proceeds from those sales for the next 36 hours are going to go to supporting those efforts in the Ukraine. And if you don't want to do that, check out the link in the description to the GoFundMe that was set up by my friend Dotto that you can that is set up to support 3 of our colorist brothers and sisters in Ukraine right now who are trying to get out, who are trying to stay safe. Let's all do our part and show what we can do as a community to support not only our colorists, but our fellow human beings. I'm excited to share where we land with that next week. Let's hit some really big numbers, and I'm going to tell you guys where we netted out when we get together for grade school next week. Thank you to Raphael for co-hosting with me today. Thanks to you guys for your awesome questions and your curiosity. And looking forward to seeing you guys for grade school next week. Everyone have an awesome weekend.